Ethiopians from all walks of life across the nation cherish and adore their self-sponsored dam, the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam. This multi-billion-dollar hydropower project is now 90% complete, thanks to the concerted efforts of Ethiopians for close to 12 years now. And Ethiopia is building this dam in a sheer attempt to fairly utilize its natural resources without harming other nations. However, there are some elements that try to obstruct this, clearly and conspicuously violating the Declaration of Principles. This and other issues along that line will be our discussion in this edition of Addis Dialogue. And my guest today is Lawrence Freeman, economic political analyst for Africa with great expertise in the area, with experience spanning 3 decades. With the program, I'm Shifar Aulag. Do stay with us. Mr. Freeman, thank you so much for joining me.
Glad to be with you today.
In one of your latest visits to Ethiopia, you took a tour of the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, known as the GERD. And you said that it was an exciting and joyful experience to examine this massive infrastructure project constructed by an emerging sub-Saharan African nation. And in one of your articles, you also wrote, dubbing the GERD a source of pride and a scientific engineering wonder. Can you please explain that to me? What does this mean?
Yes, I visited the GERD in December 2022, and it was personally a great experience for me to see this beautiful engineering marvel coming up and being built by the Ethiopians to utilize the rivers of the Blue Nile, which have been flowing for millions of years, but never used to do anything. And now the Ethiopians are putting the river to work, and it's going to produce energy, and energy is the most important thing that Africa needs right now. And I think this is an example of the kind of bold, visionary outlook that the Ethiopians have to build such a dam. And it can become a unifying element among the Ethiopian society, especially following 2 years war, which has been destructive and divided the country. The dam is an example of what all Ethiopians from all parts of the country can take pride in and can have as the identity of what their country can accomplish. So it actually should affect the mindset of the Ethiopian people. And in a way that's similar to what the Battle of Adwa did in 1896. And when I proposed that when the dam is completed, when the other 11 turbines come online sometime in 2025, we should proclaim GERD Day to go along with Adwa Day, because both of them serve as examples of what the Ethiopian people can accomplish.
Moving on from there, this colossal dam is now, I'm sure you know about this, 90% complete, and Ethiopians are going to celebrate the 12th anniversary of the laying of the foundation stone of this great dam. So what does this mean for Ethiopians, especially in terms of determination and firm stance to accomplish and finish such a great piece of work?
Well, first of all, the most important thing is the dam, when completed, we have 2 turbines working at 375 megawatts apiece, so that's 750. 11 more turbines are going to come online at 400 megawatts apiece. So this will provide 5,150 megawatts of electricity for Ethiopia, but it's already serving the dam, even though it's not completed. It's already providing development potential for the region. Electricity has been sold to Sudan, to Djibouti, and to Kenya already, and there's more transmission lines being established. Therefore, what Ethiopia has shown, even despite the destructive nature of the war for 2 years, is that the people in the government are determined that they will not be dissuaded from completing the dam, even though there's still attacks on Ethiopia from Egypt and others against the dam. They are completely false. There's no reason for anybody to react negatively against the dam. I'm displeased that my own government has not supported publicly the completion of the dam, and that's unfortunate. But nevertheless, the process is going forward. As I said, we have a minimal amount of electricity already being produced. More will be produced, and you'll have a regulation of the Nile. So the Nile will not flood Sudan or Egypt, and will be controlled, and there's no water being taken for irrigation. So many of the threats and complaints are really bogus. And I guess within about 2 months, maybe 3, we'll have the 4th filling of the dam, and that will bring us closer to reaching the 74 billion cubic meters of water that the reservoir is been built to retain. And by the way, there's a new book on the dam that's very important, very detailed in its information. It's just been published, Demystifying the Nile. And it goes through the history of both the Blue Nile, the White Nile, and the GERD, and the historical efforts to prevent Ethiopia from developing this dam, going back to the 1800s. So there should be a very rich debate on the importance of the GERD and the importance of Ethiopia utilizing Lake Tana and the Blue Nile for its own development.
Talking about pressures, threats, and things like that, an Egyptian diplomat recently said the Security Council have made it clear that the council is not competent in issues of filling and operating the GERD, and referred the issues to the regional organization, such as the Arab League and AU. So obviously there is this flip-flop. So what is the meaning of this flip-flop in your observation?
Well, I believe that the United Nations Security Council has heard the issue of the GERD several times. Several times it's been brought up before the UN Security Council. And each time the UN Security Council has refused to take any action on the GERD issue and has said that this is something that should be taken up by the African Union, and that the African Union is perfectly capable of solving a problem. And it should be African organizations that solve African issues or African conflicts. Just as we saw with the peace agreement in November 2nd in South Africa, Pretoria, the involvement of the African Union. This is an issue that does not rise to the question of UN because there's no international security issues involved. There is three main countries, Ethiopia, where the Blue Nile begins, which is 85%. If you take the water from the Sabat and the Abba, you have about 85% of the water going into the Nile comes from Ethiopia. And of course, it runs through Sudan and then into Egypt. Recently, Sudan has now begun to support the Ethiopian position. Previously, it was siding with Egypt. Now, Egypt has a problem, even though they have done some very good things in the expansion of their own development, including the Suez Canal, widening it. They believe they have historical rights given to them from colonialist Great Britain, the colonial power, over the Nile. And all of the Nile agreements previously excluded any country of the 10 countries in the Nile Basin, excluded all of them, and most especially Ethiopia, from actually having any say what happens to the Nile as it reaches the Aswan Dam, even though the majority of the water is coming from rivers in Ethiopia. So I think what is understood by international organizations and also by the nations of Africa themselves is that Ethiopia has a sovereign right to use this water to develop its nation and develop actually the Horn of Africa, and implicitly, therefore, helping Africa as a whole. The Arab League does not have standing on this issue just because Egypt belongs to the Arab League. It doesn't have standing to intervene into the African continent. So there'll be a lot of noise. There may be some threats. I saw some more threats on the internet where people are contemplating or posing the possibility of bombing the dam. I don't think this is likely. I think the process will go forward, and it's my hope that Egypt Egypt supports the dam, and the United States supports the dam because it's a dam for development. Africans are dying. I'm not using this as a figurative expression. Die for the lack of electricity. Without electricity, you don't have life. You don't have schools. You don't have hospitals. You don't have industry. You don't have homes. You don't have nothing without electricity. So to oppose the production of over 5,000 megawatts of electricity is a position that you're taking a position against life itself, because people cannot exist without electricity. And therefore, Ethiopia is doing something very positive for itself, for the Horn, and for the continent.
Also, as you might recall, sir, the Egyptian foreign minister also said all options are open and all alternatives remain available. And also that Egypt has its capabilities, things like that. What do scholars say? Such statements by the Egyptian Ministry of Foreign Affairs or other officials for that matter is a blatant violation of the Declaration of Principles. What is your take on that, sir?
I think that kind of language is dangerous because and can be very risky. African nations should not be talking about bombing infrastructure projects in other African nations. That is absolutely unacceptable. And that kind of language is dangerous because maybe someone will actually take action on it. But right now, I think the Egyptians should actually work with the Ethiopian government and other nations of the Nile Basin and formulate plans and policies that will lead to further economic development of the countries of the Nile Basin. And to make threats at this point is very dangerous. I would like to believe that those kinds of comments are being made for domestic consumption, that the leadership al-Sisi of Egypt wants to show the Egyptian people he's fighting for them, and that they are more rhetorical than real. That's my hope. But Egypt has to understand other countries have a right to develop their resources. The electricity access in Egypt is over 90%. The access to electricity in Ethiopia is, I think, 50% or less. So there is a legitimate economic, sovereign, and political right for the Ethiopians to develop this dam. In fact, they're obligated, in my view, to develop this dam. And they should be praised for the ingenuity of finally utilizing this flow of water coming from the Blue Nile.
Still staying on the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, since the groundbreaking ceremony of this colossal dam, some close to 12 years ago, Ethiopians have been asserting their fair stance of the equitable utilization of the Adwa River. Ethiopia has been, on the other hand, facing various obstacles or stumbling blocks, if you will, in a sheer attempt to obstruct the construction of this great dam, which will benefit not only Ethiopia, but the entire region, as you said, sir. From what you observed, how has Ethiopia survived the challenges, the threats to get where it is now?
Well, it has to do with the fact that the Ethiopians have a very aggressive approach to development and to the future of their nation. Even though it's still an emerging sub-Saharan African nation, they proceeded to build the first train that run by electricity from Addis Ababa to Djibouti back in 2016. And even despite the war, which destroyed parts of the northern Ethiopia during the last 2 years, the work on the dam has proceeded. And it's proceeded from one ruling administration to the next. So there's a continuity and commitment by the Ethiopian people. I don't believe anything will stop. My own personal opinion is that nothing will stop the commitment and the completion of the GERD by the Ethiopian people. And the government is obligated to make sure that this happens, and I believe it will, no matter what the obstacles are. So the commitment and the tenacious policy of completion, as we're 2 years away, is something that should be commended. And I think my own view is it's irreversible.
What are some of the multiple benefits that the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam can bring to the entire region, apart from electricity, of course? What are some of the things that it can help or it can do?
Well, in addition to electricity, it will provide the regulation of the Nile so that the flooding will be eliminated because water can be released appropriately. There's several ways that the GERD can control the flow of the Nile if there's a heavy rain. It brings a lot of nutrients to the soil in both Sudan and Egypt. And because of its elevation high up in the mountains, it will actually reduce the evaporation of the Nile, which some people put at 10% of the total volume. This evaporation will be reduced. So those are just some of the, I think, some of the benefits. I think there'll also be economic development surrounding the reservoir for fishery, for tourism, for other potentials. Now that you have this large area of water backing up behind the Nile, behind the GERD wall, also offers some positive potentials for the economy.
Yeah. So given such multiple benefits, how should the region collaborate rather than compete when it comes to the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam? What are some of the areas that they should cooperate in this regard, especially in terms of regional power integration, things like that?
Well, this is already going on. As I said, I think there's almost 300 megawatts of electricity that's presently being delivered across transmission lines to Djibouti, Sudan, and Kenya. I think that will expand rapidly. There'll be more electricity expanding to these countries and also to other countries in the region. And hopefully this will drive the economic development policy, because you cannot have an industrialized economic power, or a country cannot become industrialized unless it has sufficient and abundant electricity. And also, this is the way to eliminate poverty, because the main cause of poverty is the lack of electricity, the lack of food. And with this kind of development, Ethiopia, which has already made progress in reducing its poverty rate, I think will make greater progress. And of the 50 plus million people who are without access to electricity, they will now have access. So lives will change. Ethiopia will make more forward motion in developing its economy and expanding its economy, and the region will also benefit.
Let's also talk about the recent visit by Antony Blinken, the U.S. Secretary of State, who has visited Ethiopia recently, which is being hailed as a great move to ramp up the rapprochement between the two nations. As an expert of African issues, what are some of your general observations here, especially in beefing up the bilateral ties between the U.S. and Ethiopia?
The government of Ethiopia was pleased with the trip of the Secretary of State of the United States, Antony Blinken, to Ethiopia recently. This could well be the beginning of resuming more positive relationships between the two countries. During the war, the 2-year-long war, the United States was undermining the government of Ethiopia and undermining the government of the Prime Minister, Dr. Abiy Ahmed. There's no question about it. There are claims to the contrary, but they're wrong. The United States took a position that weakened the government and de facto helped the TPLF. Now that the war and the cessation of hostilities was completed in November 2nd in 2022 in South Africa, the country is moving in a peaceful direction, has a lot of problems to overcome. Secretary of State Blinken offered $331 million more in aid, and the United States already is the largest aid provider in Ethiopia and much of the world. However, there are problems with the Secretary of State's visit and what followed. One is Ethiopia needs about $50 billion for economic development to reconstruct the country and expand the country. $331 million in aid is not going to be sufficient. Aid, first of all, is necessary, but it's limited. We need long-term, low-interest loans coming from the US and other countries in the West so that infrastructure can be built, schools can be built, roads can be built, more electricity, more railroads, more hospitals. This is what's required, and this would help to unify the country. The second problem is last week, I believe on March 20th, the Secretary of State issued a statement condemning Ethiopia, along with the other entities, such as the TPLF, Eritrea, and Amara militia, for human rights violations and crimes against humanity. And earlier in the war, Antony Blinken egregiously and blatantly, without any evidence, talked about ethnic cleansing and genocide, which is still being discussed as, quote, human rights violations. So this signals to me that the United States policy is not one to completely resume positive relations with Ethiopia. What is happening inside the Biden administration and the Secretary of State Blinken State Department is that they want to use human rights issue, so-called good governance, so-called democracy, so-called accountability. They want to use as a weapon against Ethiopia to weaken the country. And this is part of the geopolitical world outlook of trying to control the Horn of Africa. The fact that you ended the war, and by all accounts, including Blinken's account, there has been a decrease in violence. To make this issue at this time, following his trip, which was seen as positive, greatly undermines the commitment, indicates that the United States' commitment to Ethiopia is not what it should be. They are not, the United States so far, our government that is, or the Biden administration is not fully committed to the development of Ethiopia. You don't, right now, the most important way to deal with human rights and democracy and good governance, as they call it, is to actually get the country unified around a common mission. One mission is the completion of the GERD. The second mission should be the economic reconstruction of the country to eliminate poverty and hunger through economic infrastructure development. That would do more, much more than promote the so-called issue of human rights the way they discuss it. We're at a critical moment to move forward. And the State Department, following what appeared to be a positive first step by Blinken's visit, is undermining that relationship by bringing these issues up now in this way. The accountability has to be handled by Ethiopians. I think there's a transitional justice accountability commission being set up, and it is not, should be not be the subject of manipulation by the United States. The United States, if they want to help Ethiopia, should make the long-term credit available for economic development. That would be far, far more positive than the comments that the State Department issued last week regarding crimes against humanity, accusing the Ethiopian government of crimes against humanity. I would add that one of the problems that still exists is that my Ethiopian friends, both in Ethiopia and in the United States, they don't really fully understand what is driving United States policy towards their country. They don't understand the reality of a geopolitical ideology. And sometimes they doubt my analysis because they'll see something good done one day and they say, oh, this indicates things are getting better. Things now between the United States and Ethiopia are getting better. And they don't understand that there's long waves of history and policy that has been going on in the United States really since the death of Franklin Roosevelt in 1945. I've been studying this and involved in policy making in the United States for over 50 years. I know what I'm talking about. And I wish that people would understand that there are not homogeneous, but heteronomic influences in the United States government, and some of which want to see a weakened Ethiopia. It's contrary to normal thinking, but some people believe that's the best way to control the Horn of Africa, and that sometimes they oppose strong leadership and strong policies such as the building of the GERD and other economic policies. So while the Ethiopians should welcome any overture that comes from the United States, we have to be sophisticated enough to understand that there's other policies that are not in favor of Ethiopia that are working inside the Biden administration.
I know you have a wonderful expertise and experience spanning, 3 or more decades. And I know what you're talking about, sir. And that's really something, and that's really need to be appreciated. Thank you so much, sir. Thank you. Thanks a lot for your time and for your wonderful ideas.
Thank you very much. I'm glad we were able to have this interview.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, dear viewers, with that, we come to the end of today's program. Thank you as well for having been with us. And till I see you next time with another program, it's goodbye from me, Shifa Dalak.